Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. Before we start, I just wanted to remind you all that my literal favorite thing is hearing from you. You know that. Okay, maybe not literally, not when I could be playing basketball and reliving my high school days, but it's up there. So, you know my email, noam@jewishnunpack.com. Okay, yalla. Let's do this. I like to joke that I'm an introvert dressed up as an extrovert. Inside, I'm somewhat of a curmudgeon with strong opinions about all the things, typically none of them consequential. Like, when hosting a meal, put out your beverages immediately. And stop sneezing into your hands. It's disgusting. But you never know how secretly obsessive I really am because I spend 80 hours a week talking to strangers and facilitating community in my private life. And I really love it. I do. Because these aren't just strangers. The people I'm speaking to, they're young people, not exclusively Jewish at all, who are eager and interested to learn the story of Israel. It's always in the news, with all its complications, its beauty, its nuances, its warts, and its black eyes. Mostly people are excited for these conversations. They want to learn. They're open to listening to the different angles of the same story they think they know. But there's one topic that really gets a room going. Like, this is the party starter. One topic where opinions seem to come from the gut and the heart, from feelings rather than facts. It turns out that nothing gets people fired up like the following question. Is Israel an apartheid state? I said it. I asked it. I did. Yeah. Is Israel an apartheid state? Maybe you've heard this question / allegation / accusation before. Maybe you're like 90% of the Jewish students I talk to who scream, "No way!" without quite understanding why people believe that Israeli institutions are inherently racist when the person who is espousing it really doesn't seem anti-Semitic at all, and when some Israeli NGOs even claim it. Maybe you're like the 16-year-old who once raised his hand in a crowded lecture hall 3 years ago and told me in perfect earnestness, I have no idea what apartheid is, but I know I'm supposed to say Israel's absolutely not that. Honestly, kudos to that guy. For real. He was open, he was honest, and he revealed something both true and upsetting when it comes to learning about Israel. All sides have a tendency to prioritize slogans over facts, and there's a reason for it, because people are defensive. And I get it. When I ask the same question of non-Jewish students at America's most elite private high schools, I often get the same knee-jerk responses from some. Of course, Israel's an apartheid state, they would argue. Everyone knows that, so why am I even asking? But if I ask for more information, like what exactly that means, well, the conversation goes something like this.
So wait, is there apartheid in there?
If you're asking for a personal opinion, yes. Yeah.
What do you mean personal opinion?
As in, just my opinion, yes, yeah. And then...
I'm a bit confused, sorry. Because, like, the personal opinion does not matter. The fact doesn't matter, right? Like, if there is an apartheid or no.
That's Yosef Haddad, an Israeli Arab, talking to a representative of Students for Justice in Palestine, aka SJP, at the University of Auckland in February of 2023. The student is sitting at a table strewn with literature and Palestinian flags, but when Yosef asks her about her political stance, she can't muster a single fact to support her opinion. And look, I get it. I'm not here to call out college students or 16-year-olds. I'm not criticizing anyone. This isn't a personal failure of high school and university students. It's a failure of the systems that educated, or rather didn't educate them. It's about the indoctrination that goes on. Plus, apartheid isn't an easy word to hear, not for anyone. Who likes thinking about state-enforced systems that separate people by race? Who enjoys grappling with the question, hey, does this huge group of people lack basic rights for no reason other than their ethnic identity? But it's not just that the question is a bummer, such a bummer, forcing you to confront inconvenient truths and ugly realities when you'd rather be, I don't know, talking to the group chat about whether to start Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes in your fantasy football league. At the time of this recording, it's absolutely Jackson. And for the rest of you, sorry if that went over your head. For millions of Jews and Arabs, the question of Israeli apartheid is a trigger. Depending on where you're standing, it's either a painful reminder or a personal attack, or both. For the past year, so many Jews have felt besieged from all corners, on social media, in the news, at our universities, in our elementary schools. Jews are hearing that the Jewish state is illegitimate, that quote-unquote Zionists aren't welcome anywhere, that they have to cut away an essential part of their identity to fit in. Plenty of Jews in Israel and elsewhere have serious problems with Israeli policies, but these conversations aren't about Israeli policy. It never becomes about that. In fact, they're not conversations at all. Showing up outside synagogues with megaphones isn't a conversation. Vandalizing the homes of museum directors for some imagined crime isn't a conversation. For over a year, Jews and non-Jews around the world have been demonized and branded genocidaires just for suggesting that maybe a country of 10 million people shouldn't just be outright destroyed. On the other side, Palestinians have spent the past year feeling dehumanized. And not just this past year, but this past year, they've watched the death toll in Gaza tick higher and higher, trying desperately to help their friends and family before it's too late. They've rallied and demonstrated and voted for the war to end, for institutions to divest from Israel, for the US to stop arming Israel, with very little success. For them, hearing people question the claim that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israeli law is stacked against them, just adds insult to injury. So I recognize very clearly what I'm wading into here. It's a minefield. But here's what I think. I think that whatever you feel about this question is valid. It's your feeling. And it's understandable. No matter what quote-unquote side you're on, we all have feelings. While facts may not care about your feelings, yes, we've heard that, here's the reality. Feelings often don't care about your facts. They're natural. I've got them in spades. I feel. Again, mostly about fantasy football and where people sneeze, but hey, everyone needs hobbies. Here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to sloganeer or give talking points or parrot the myths and facts that each side presents. That would do us all a disservice. And that's not why you come to this podcast. That's not what you're interested in. You're not interested in sloganeering. You could get that everywhere. You're not interested in indoctrination. You can get that everywhere. You're not interested in propaganda. You could get that everywhere. You listening, you can handle complexity. You deserve complexity. And also, like I said, that's why you come to this podcast. We both know that. Because this isn't some theoretical debate you can use to score social points or demonstrate your commitment to one ideology or another. We are talking about a daily reality for millions of Israelis and Palestinians alike. And when we retreat to the familiar knee-jerk opinions we've been trained to parrot, we are hurting real people and not giving enough credit to ourselves. Denying someone's lived reality, like what they experience, it's a great way to push them towards extremism. The reflexive, context-free claim that Israel is an apartheid state ignores some very important background and robs Palestinians and Palestinian leadership of agency. How infantilizing, how unproductive. And it ignores the fact that extremism breeds extremism. There's no better way to drive Israelis into the arms of the hard right than to reflexively demonize their country. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to explore the claim. Yes, 2 weeks. This is a 2-part episode because we have a lot to cover. In this episode, we'll talk about what apartheid really is. So you're not that kid from 3 years ago. And we'll talk about the situation in the West Bank. And next week, we're going to talk about East Jerusalem and come to some conclusions based on the facts and the different perspectives. What I ask from you, dear listener, is to loosen your shoulders, put your guard down, and listen. I'm also asking one other thing. If you don't like my conclusions or my analysis, that's okay. But don't just unsubscribe and leave a 1-star review telling the world how full of crap I am. Let's engage. Let's have a real conversation. As always, my email is noam@jewishunpacked.com. And I love hearing from you. One more note before we begin. I've tried to conquer my own biases to the extent that I can. But I know, and you know, that every story contains bias, and every human contains bias. No matter who you are or what story you're telling, we all make choices about what to emphasize and what to omit. I'm no different. But at the very least, I've done my best to be honest and thorough because this podcast is guided by the 3 C's: content, curiosity, and courage. Content comes first. We need to know the facts. We got to be informed. But it takes curiosity and courage to listen to uncomfortable truths, to confront realities that don't jive with yours, to remember that yours is not the only narrative, it's not the only story, and it takes compassion too. Okay, fine, so a 4th C. Especially when you're listening to someone describe their suffering, their trauma, their pain. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about life in Israel and the West Bank. Let's lay out the facts and listen to the people whose lives they govern. Welcome to our 2-part episode on Is Israel Apartheid? Yalla, let's do this.
And so while I don't shrink back from my ultimate conclusions, that this ideal of Zionism, this idea of a state project has come at the expense of another group of people, that it itself has erected an apartheid project. I believe that.
Even if you don't recognize the voice, you probably recognize the name of the person speaking. Ta-Nehisi Coates is an American journalist famous for his stylish prose and his willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about race and history and identity. He's testified before Congress. Pretty cool. And he won a MacArthur Genius Grant. I haven't. And he published award-winning best-selling books in multiple genres, many of which I've read and loved. He's a special dude. Some have even described his voice as prophetic for this generation. That's a lot. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is far from his normal fodder about American race relations. All his life, he'd heard the situation was complicated, that it required nuance, history, maybe a PhD to fully understand. But after a 10-day trip to Israel and the West Bank, he came to a conclusion. It wasn't complicated, he said, and it was apartheid. Here he is again.
We were traveling all over the West Bank, and there were, roads that we could take or that we couldn't take, rather, because we were traveling the way that Palestinians would normally travel. And then there were other roads that Jewish settlers were able to take. If a Palestinian is arrested on the West Bank, they are subject to the military system of justice, whereas if a Jewish settler is arrested on the West Bank, they're subjected to the civil system. And I was made aware of the differing water laws that, govern you depending on who you are. An entire separate system of justice that was unequal, an entire separate system of governance, I should say, that was separate and unequal. As a descendant of someone or peoples who were born into a system of governance that was separate and unequal, it was very hard for me to not be struck by that emotionally.
There it is again. That strong emotional response that affects all of us, that shapes our stories and our opinions and our worldview. But put aside his emotional connection for a second. Is he right? Has Zionism erected an apartheid project with different water laws, different justice systems, different governance for people who are kept separate and unequal based solely on their religion? Well, to answer that, we've got to go back in time. We are a history podcast, after all. So our understanding of apartheid should be rooted in history. And the history of apartheid as a legal institutionalized system starts 76 years ago on the southern edge of the map. Part 1, a brief and ugly history of apartheid. South Africa, 1948. The National Party government had just taken power, but no one was fooled by their bland name because the National Party was made up of white supremacists. Actual Nazi style, if you ain't white, you ain't right type of white supremacists. Usually, I don't take white supremacists very seriously. They're odd. Well, that was mean, sorry, but okay. They're not really my thing. It's just true. In the US, they tend to march around waving tiki torches. Where do they buy them, by the way? And having strong opinions about the casting of live-action Disney remakes, which seems like maybe not the most important issue in the world, just saying. Don't at me, Disney adults. By the way, if you missed this so-called controversy over Disney casting a black Little Mermaid, well, honestly, you're doing something right, so good for you. But the white supremacists of South Africa were doing a heck of a lot more than that. They ruled a diverse majority black country using every lever of power to institute a state-planned, state-enforced system of racial discrimination. To make sure no one escaped the system, they divided the entire country into 4 racial categories. Here they are: white, black, colored, mixed race, and Indian. By the way, I know that the term colored as a way to refer to people has a tough history in the US, but since it was the official term used in apartheid South Africa, I'm going to apologize. You're going to hear me say it a couple more times when referring to multiracial South Africans. So trigger warning, in effect. Your race was your destiny, determining where you could live, who you can marry, what kind of job you could get, and even what services you could access. If your parents didn't clearly match one of these categories, the government would run highly scientific tests on you to decide where you fit in. And when I say highly scientific, I mean not scientific at all. Take the infamous pencil test. It's like, sorry for laughing while saying it, but here it is. Listen to this. It's wild. Some government official was literally paid to put pencils in people's hair and watch what happened when they shook their heads. If the pencil fell out, the person was white. If it stayed in, they'd get classified as black or colored. And since genetics are weird and unpredictable, some members of the same family might get classified as white or colored while others were deemed black, meaning that by law, those families now had to split up. After all, The Group Areas Act decreed that people of different races couldn't live in the same neighborhoods. So the government forcibly removed millions of Black South Africans from their homes, shoving them into overcrowded townships far from the big cities. Meanwhile, the Separate Amenities Act made sure white people had top-of-the-line public services, while Black South Africans were left with the dregs. Apartheid, after all, means separateness in Afrikaans, similar to the segregation of the United States before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But where the United States Supreme Court pretended segregation was, and I quote, separate but equal, good one, South Africa's National Party had no such illusions. The apartheid system was designed to be separate and unequal, and the National Party wasn't shy about using all the powers at their disposal to enforce it. The parliament, the courts, the police, and the military worked in tandem to ensure that Black South Africans were kept disenfranchised. It was impossible to escape. Every deck was stacked. I could tell you about the laws that kept Black students uneducated and trained for a life of servitude. I could tell you about the laws that prohibited people of different races from mingling, like the comedian Trevor Noah. He's what the National Party would have called colored, meaning mixed race. His mom was Black, his dad was white, and that's why his autobiography is called Born a Crime. According to the Mixed Marriages Act, Trevor shouldn't exist. If these laws sound at all familiar to you, that may be because they were painfully similar to the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow laws of the United States. In short, and please prepare yourself because I'm about to say something highly sophisticated, apartheid South Africa was bad. Like really, really bad. In fact, the United Nations Apartheid Convention calls the system inhuman. The Rome Statute of the ICC declares it inhumane. I see you adding the E in there, Rome Statute. Well played. Black South Africans fought back. They may have been institutionally and legally powerless, but they were still the majority. Groups like the African National Congress, ANC, led protests and strikes, marching and campaigning side by side with white folks, including many Jews who were classified as white under this system, in case you were wondering. It didn't matter how hard the government cracked down or how many protesters they banned or jailed or exiled or killed. Internal resistance made the country ungovernable. Nations all over the world slapped South Africa with sanctions and boycotts, destroying morale and decimating the economy. And then there was the internal shame. Many white people were disgusted by this system and dedicated themselves to ending it. Others had lived with it just fine until the world started boycotting their country. It was demoralizing and embarrassing to see musicians and sports teams and global institutions boycott and censure South Africa. The pressure was overpowering. Less than 50 years after the National Party took power, the government buckled and the system fell apart. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. Nelson Mandela became the country's first Black president, and they all lived happily ever after in their rainbow nation. Well, okay, not quite, but this isn't unpacking South African history, which, side note, someone should really start. Go for it. So let's move back north to Israel and ask, knowing what we know about apartheid South Africa, does the charge of apartheid apply? Are organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch correct to call the Jewish state an apartheid regime? Well, we've defined apartheid, but we haven't defined Israel. Part 2, Israel. The Jewish state controls a lot of disputed territory. Israel has never had clear or defined borders, and a significant number of its neighbors have believed it shouldn't exist at all. So when I talk about Israel or Israel proper or mainland Israel, I'm referring to territory that Israel held before 1967. After 1967, the map starts getting complicated. Israel quadrupled its territory after the Six-Day War. Link in the show notes if you want to learn more. In 1981, Israel officially annexed East Jerusalem as part of its capital. But the international community doesn't recognize that annexation, and East Jerusalem remains disputed at the international level. Then there's the West Bank, which Israel never annexed. Today, it's home to over 400,000 Jewish Israelis and around 3 million Palestinians. And of course, there's Gaza, which is now entirely Palestinian. We're not going to talk about Gaza in this two-parter because it is an active war zone at this time. Plus, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Again, see our episode about that. And from 2006 to 2023, the ruling party, Hamas, made and enforced Gaza's laws. Sure, the Israelis retain the power to decide which Gazans are allowed to cross the border into Israel, just like Egyptians do for the Egyptian border. But I wouldn't really call that apartheid. I'd call that border control, which you may or may not like, but that's what it is. It's border control. So that leaves us with 3 areas we need to understand: Israel proper, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, all of them home to Israelis and Palestinians alike. Let's get Israel proper out of the way first. It's kind of funny. The Jewish state is only 74% Jewish. That should have been Nerd Corner alert, by the way. I missed it, sorry. But it means that more than a quarter of Israeli citizens are not Jews. Religiously, they're Christians, they're Muslims, they're Druze, they're Baha'i, and a smattering of other things. Ethnically, the majority of those non-Jews are Arabs. Every single one of those non-Jews is legally guaranteed full rights as equal citizens, including the right to worship freely, no matter their religion. But it's not just about numbers. These non-Jews serve as government ministers, military officers, business leaders, and Supreme Court judges. They vote in elections. They hold high-ranking positions across the 3 branches of government, including the Supreme Court. No public institutions are legally segregated, not hospitals, not universities, not benches or beaches or bathrooms or water fountains or cafes. There are no laws designed to separate non-Jews from Jews. No Population and Registration Act, no separate Representation of Voters Act, no separate Amenities Act. In fact, up until 2018, not a single piece of Israeli legislation explicitly differentiated between Jews and non-Jews, with the exception of citizenship and immigration laws, which we'll get into in a second. But then in the summer of 2018, after weeks of protests, the Knesset passed the nation-state law by a very slim margin, 62 for, 55 against, 2 abstentions. The controversial law defines Israel as a Jewish state, establishes Hebrew as its official language, and states that, quote, the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. In practice, the law hasn't actually done much of anything. It didn't change any laws. It didn't take away any rights. Street signs and state documents still feature Arabic and sometimes English. Arab citizens of all religions are still university presidents and doctors and police officers and military officials. The nation-state law has turned out to be more symbolic than practical. Now, we can debate what it's a symbol of and whether it's a good symbol or not, but to hold it up as an example of apartheid is, in my opinion, pretty silly because it didn't actually change anything. But again, we need to be real here. That's what we do, right? Of course, there's always a gulf between law and lived experience. Non-Jews may be fully equal on paper, and they are, but in reality, things are always more complicated. A number of Israel cities are considered mixed. I put that in quotes, at least in my head. Here it is, mixed. Haifa is roughly 12% Arab, Lod and Akko about 30%, Jaffa roughly a third. Still, most Arabs live in their own neighborhoods and send their children to Arab schools. These neighborhoods and schools are often under-resourced and neglected by the state with absurd rates of crime. Some communities even lack bomb shelters, like the Bedouin town of Rahat, which is close to the Gaza border. Many Israeli Arabs speak only passable Hebrew, which means they have a harder time finding well-paying jobs. There are stories about Israeli Arabs being harassed or even arrested for posting political opinions that are deemed sympathetic to terrorism. There are reports of Jews refusing to rent apartments to Arabs, just straight up ghosting or saying actually never mind when they learn that the applicant is Arab. But don't take my word for it. Listen to an actual Palestinian. I don't know the name of the person you're about to hear. He chose to remain anonymous when he agreed to be interviewed for Barry Weiss's podcast, Honestly. The whole episode is really worth a listen because it perfectly illustrates the complexity of this whole situation. The man speaking is one of the few West Bank Palestinians to get an education and a job within Israel. When he was a student at Tel Aviv University, he'd spend up to 8 hours a day waiting at the checkpoints that separate the West Bank from Israel proper, just so he could get to his classes. 8 hours to travel a distance of less than 50 miles. But renting an apartment in Tel Aviv wasn't really an option.
Coming to Tel Aviv, especially when wanting to rent an apartment, was one of the most difficult tasks that I have ever had to face. Usually, I start the conversation over Facebook once I see an ad. And at the beginning, I tell them from the West Bank, I get an instant block. So I start kind of doing something else, saying I'm from Jerusalem. So it's kind of vague. And once they see me, I get past the conversation over Facebook, and then I go to see the apartment. And when I meet them, I tell them I'm Palestinian and I'm looking for an apartment. I need to attend my classes. And I need an apartment. I'm desperate, and to be honest, like the success rate was zero.
It's not surprising that Israelis and Palestinians don't trust each other in our current climate. Is it sad? Sure. Is it fair? Nope, not to anyone. But is it apartheid? I think the facts would say no, not at all. We're talking about a Palestinian Arab man who earned a master's degree in Israel, now works for an Israeli company. Sure, he faced real and significant challenges getting to where he is today. But he studied in Israel. He works in Israel. He has close Israeli friends. That isn't apartheid. It just isn't. Okay, what about Israeli policies? Like the legally enshrined right of return for Jews and only Jews, which guaranteed all Jews the right to move to Israel and gain automatic citizenship. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the gist. That doesn't sound democratic, does it? Okay, let's do this. Israel's far from the only country that fast-tracks citizenship applications based on ethnicity. Repatriation laws, that's what they're called, exist in Greece and Finland and Poland and Germany and Armenia and Italy and a whole bunch of other countries. They're a fascinating subset of international humanitarian laws, and I encourage you to check out some links in the show notes. Okay, how about the fact that Arabs and Jews can't get legally married in Israel? That doesn't sound very good. Until you explore the context. This is my friend, journalist and historian Haviv Retagor, talking to a colleague about Israel's convoluted marriage laws.
When the Ottoman Empire ruled this place, it basically created a system in which all the many different religious and ethnic minorities of the region, of the empire, basically could marry each other the way they wanted to marry each other. So there would be Jewish courts marrying Jews and Muslim courts marrying Muslims, and everybody kind of took care of themselves. And it was a way for the empire to be open and respectful of all the different minorities. Nobody likes this system in Israel. Nobody thinks it's a good system. But the culture war that would develop the second we started to write our own system was too great. It's too scary for anyone to ever do away with the old Ottoman imperial system. And so the Ottoman imperial system is still in effect. Israelis have found workarounds that have allowed them to marry anybody they want.
In other words, it's not that Arabs and Jews can't get married because of some wackadoodle concept of racial or religious purity. They can't get married in Israel because there is no civil marriage in Israel at all. That factoid matters. If you want to get married in Israel, and by the way, Mazel Tov, so happy for you, you have to go through religious courts, which don't perform interfaith marriages. Not the Jewish court and Nerd Corner alert, there it is. Neither does the Druze court or the Catholic court, which are all very particular about Catholics marrying Catholics and Jews marrying Jews and so on. The Muslim court will perform an interfaith marriage if it's between a Muslim man and a non-Muslim woman, but a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim man, no dice. Out of luck. Okay, Nerd Corner over. I didn't mean to get into a tangent about Israel's labyrinth marriage laws. But it's important to give context to the laws that might seem discriminatory at first glance, but are a lot more complicated once you know all the facts. Facts matter. So, okay, the state of Israel proper, not apartheid. Cool, great. But what about Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument, which we played at the top of this episode? Unequal water laws, separate roads, different legal systems. If that's not happening in Israel proper, then what, or rather, where is he talking about? Part 3, the West Bank. The West Bank. Even the name is contentious, though it's simply a geographical description of the area west of the Jordan River, sandwiched between Jordan and mainland Israel. But no one appreciates a simple geographical description. People have opinions. People want you to know it's, quote, the occupied West Bank, or, quote, the occupied Palestinian territories. Some even call it Palestine. Or else they call this strip of land Judea and Samaria, since it's been home to the Jewish people since biblical times, a few thousand years. I'm just going to call it the West Bank, because that's the most common and neutral descriptor. We're not going to go into the biblical history of the place, as fascinating as that would be and as important as that is. We'll just rewind by a century or so to the British Mandate. From the 16th century until World War I, the West Bank was a part of the Ottoman Empire, okay? But after World War I, the Ottoman Empire no longer existed. Instead, until 1948, the land was a part of the British Mandate, just like the rest of the area was. But as you know from listening to our episodes on Israel before 1948, link in the show notes to all those episodes, the Mandate period wasn't exactly chill and uncomplicated. Jews and Arabs were often at each other's throats, and after World War II, the Brits were done with this whole headache. So in 1947, the UN voted to partition Palestine into 2 states. 43% of the territory would go to the Palestinian state, to an Arab state, including the West Bank. 56% would go to the Jewish state, including the Negev Desert. The plan allotted more territory to the Jews on the assumption that millions of Jewish refugees would soon move there. Jerusalem and Bethlehem would be international zones, neither Jewish nor Arab. But as we know the story, the UN vision never came to pass. Palestinian leaders rejected partition, as did all the other Arab or Muslim countries. So when Israel declared independence in May of 1948, the surrounding Arab world responded with a declaration of war. When the dust cleared, the Jewish state was still standing. The West Bank and East Jerusalem were now in Jordanian hands, crowded by hundreds of thousands of refugees who either fled or were expelled. By 1949, more than half of the pre-war Arab population of British Mandate Palestine had resettled in the West Bank, trying desperately to start over and piercingly aware of everything they lost. In 1954, they were granted Jordanian citizenship for some reason that I don't understand. So despite their Jordanian citizenship, many of these West Bank Palestinians were crowded into squalid refugee camps that still exist today, though the crowded tents have since given way to concrete buildings. But in June of 1967, the West Bank came under Israeli control. That's the only real way to describe it because Israel didn't actually annex the West Bank. Again, important fact. It doesn't officially consider the West Bank part of its territory, like Tel Aviv or Haifa or even the Golan Heights. Ever since 1967, the West Bank has existed in a sort of limbo. It's not technically Israeli territory, but it's not Israeli territory either. And if that sounds confusing, well, it is. On the one hand, every Israeli administration since 1967 explicitly incentivized Jews to move to the West Bank, whether through cheaper mortgages, tax relief, or simply rhetoric. At the same time, every Israeli prime minister has kept the West Bank on the table as a bargaining chip for future negotiations. Some have even decried the settlements, most notably Yitzhak Rabin, who at one point called them a cancer. Not afraid to be controversial, that guy. Today, over 400,000 Jews live in the West Bank. Some are there for religious reasons. After all, the West Bank is deeply tied to Jewish history. It's like the most Jewish place of all time. Others are there for the cheap land and the high quality of life. And nearly all agree that the territory is strategically important because it's located in the highlands that overlook central Israel. In other words, it's the perfect place to launch a serious attack on Israeli cities. But until 1991, Israelis and Palestinians moved freely between Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. There was no barrier between the West Bank and Israel. None. Nada. Zero. Zilch. You get the point. No checkpoints. No roadblocks. No soldiers. No walls or fences or barriers. No showing ID. Traveling between the three territories was more or less like crossing from one U.S. state into another. All that changed at the height of the First Intifada. Not to be a broken record, but link in the show notes. In 1991, Israel began to require a permit for any Palestinian who wanted to enter Israel or East Jerusalem or to travel between the West Bank and Gaza. At first, the permit system was a minor inconvenience, but as the Palestinian violence worsened, the Israelis began to restrict the number of permits they handed out. March of 1993 was particularly bloody. 9 Israeli civilians and 6 Israeli soldiers were killed that month alone, some with particular brutality. And so Israel installed its first checkpoints. Those checkpoints have only multiplied in the last 3 decades, growing every time an Israeli is shot or stabbed or bombed or kidnapped by a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza. Meanwhile, the settlements/Jewish communities expanded. As of November 2024, when I'm recording this, over 400,000 Jews live in the West Bank, right next door to nearly 3 million Palestinians, something like that. And though the settlements were once a major issue in Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, Israelis are deeply wary of ceding any strategic or security advantage. And those 400,000 Israeli Jews in the West Bank provide a security advantage. But the international community, not to mention the Palestinians, isn't so happy about this state of affairs. Here's their argument against Israeli control of the West Bank. Number 1, under international law, countries aren't allowed to keep territory they won in war. To quote the draft Declaration of the Rights of States, Article 9, here it is. Every state has the duty to refrain from resorting to war as an instrument of national policy and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. And here's Article 11. Every state has the duty to refrain from recognizing any territorial acquisition by another state acting in violation of Article 9. In other words, you're not allowed to take land from other parties, even if you're fighting a defensive war. And if you do, the other member states aren't allowed to recognize your control of the territory. That's the law. Whether states follow it is another question entirely, and there's a whole debate about this. But on to the second argument against Israel's control of the West Bank. Number 2, the West Bank is supposed to be a major part of a potential future Palestinian state. And number 3, millions of Palestinians in the West Bank live under Israeli military control but don't have rights as citizens. As we discussed in our 1967 series, some Israeli leaders immediately sounded the alarm when Israel took control of the West Bank, calling for an immediate and unilateral return of the territory. And over the years, many Israelis have criticized their country's policies towards the West Bank. But even though Israel has participated in numerous talks to finalize the West Bank status, Rabin's was the only administration to effect real change. You might remember our episode on the Oslo Accords, but in case you don't, here's the quick and dirty summary. The Accords were an interim agreement to lay the groundwork for a potential two-state solution, even though it never technically said that. What does that mean exactly? Well, to start, they established the Palestinian Authority, aka the Palestinian government. See, before Oslo, Israel didn't recognize any Palestinian group as legitimate. They were viewed as terrorists as a whole. But if you want a state, you need a government. So the PA was formed to give the Palestinians a go at ruling themselves. Of course, the PA wasn't going to rule within Israel. Instead, they would take over parts of the West Bank and Gaza. If you're listening to this while you're driving or washing the dishes or something, then this might be a good place to pause, because this next part will be a little confusing unless you look at a map of the West Bank. And I don't want you to miss a stain on your dishes at all, or like miss a right turn if you're driving. Because once you have a map, you'll probably notice 3 things. 1, the West Bank is divided into 3 areas, very creatively named. Ready for this? Areas A, B, and C. 2, these areas are not contiguous. They're all chopped up into tiny pieces so that parts of areas A and B are entirely separated from each other. Keep that in mind when we talk about freedom of movement. And 3, Area C is by far the biggest area. These areas only exist because of the Oslo Accords, which the Palestinians and Israelis agreed to. So what's the difference? We'll start with Area A. Okay, Area A is home to about 60% of the West Bank Palestinians, though in terms of land, it's only around 18% of the West Bank. This is where the big Palestinian cities are that you may have heard of: Ramallah, Nablus, which is Shechem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho. You might recognize those names from the Bible, right? No matter what you feel about Israel's policy towards the West Bank, it's impossible to deny the historical connection between Jews and this land. And no, that's not a justification of any policy either way. And it's also not an erasure of Palestinians' claims to the land. It's just a fact that complicates, well, everything. The Palestinian Authority runs Area A. They're in charge of governance, security, elections, schools, police, healthcare, water, sanitation, and all the other glamorous and exciting aspects of government. No Israelis allowed, though. For real, I'm not just being glib. Israeli citizens are not allowed to enter Area A, not even if they hold foreign passports. In 2000, before there were as many checkpoints, before there was a security fence and signs everywhere screaming, "Do not enter," 2 Israelis made a wrong turn into Ramallah. I'll spare you the details of what happened to them. The incident became known as the Ramallah lynching, and it's one of the most traumatic and iconic symbols of the Second Intifada. Israelis may be forbidden from entering Area A, but that doesn't mean the area is independent of Israel, not by a long shot. The PA relies on Israel for nearly everything, from water to tax revenue. That last one might sound confusing, so let's break it down. Like all governments, the PA collects local taxes from its citizens in the West Bank. Israel doesn't have anything to do with those. But the Palestinian Authority also relies heavily on foreign aid. In 1994, the PA and Israel agreed that Israel would collect duties and taxes on any goods entering the Palestinian territories and pay out the revenue to the PA each month. If you're curious, that comes out to about $150 million per month. Yes, US dollars. Here's how my friend Noor al-Din, who lives in Area A, describes the agreement.
The agreement was that Israel is going to collect the tax money because the Palestinian Authority is not yet independent state, doesn't control borders, doesn't have an airport or a seaport. They will collect tax money for export tax, and then they will hand it over to the Palestinian Authority after they deduct 3% as collection fee.
That's a lot of money, more than a third of the PA's yearly budget. But when tensions are high, the Israelis sometimes just don't transfer that cash until the PA complies with whatever terms they impose. Sometimes those terms are pretty legit, like stop blowing up our buses or don't hold reconciliation talks with Hamas. To me, those sound like pretty decent justifications to not pay the PA. But as Noor points out, it's always more complicated than that.
But after the 2000s, I think, Israel used it always as a way to to control the Palestinian Authority, to put pressure on it. Whenever they want, they just like stop this money for whatever excuses they can say. It doesn't matter, but like at the end, people are not getting their salaries.
That's the thing. These policies are directed at the PA, a government that makes some very questionable decisions, like paying a monthly salary to families of suicide bombers, which directly incentivizes terrorism. But ordinary people also bear the brunt of these policies. And yes, there are ordinary people there. And the most difficult policy of all is probably the restrictions on movement. Here's Noor again.
Now, in the last 9 months, for me to fight depression, I just had to accept that my zone of movement is just the city of Bethlehem. My friends will just go crazy a little bit and tell me, Noor, let's go to Ramallah together. You know how much of thinking I think, to go to Ramallah? Like there's at least 3 checkpoints on the way. And the
So you had to go
soldiers,
through 3 checkpoints.
yeah, the soldiers will stop us at one of these checkpoints. So they can use any just security justification.
Noor lives in Bethlehem, which is in Area A. So is Ramallah, which takes 3 checkpoints to get to. So when I say that Palestinians have full freedom of movement in Area A, that's only somewhat true. They have full freedom of movement once they're inside their particular part of Area A. But since Area A isn't contiguous, even if everything you need is in Area A, your family, your school, your hospital, your intramural soccer team, whatever, there's a strong chance you may need to pass through a checkpoint just to get to where you need to get to. Which means that every time you want to go somewhere, you have to consider, is it worth the wait at the checkpoint? And it also means that most Palestinians only encounter Israelis as soldiers in interactions that are tense, uncomfortable, and possibly even dangerous. The soldiers have the power in this instance. They can delay you. They can make you miss work or school or medical appointments. They can make you wait in a long, slow, crowded line. They can humiliate you. They can search your things. Even if they see you every single day, even if they know your face, where you're going, and what you do when you're there. And that's if the checkpoints are even open. Sometimes, usually in times of tension, checkpoints can be closed out of the blue. So if you're trying to get somewhere, you either have to find another route or you're out of luck. I want to be very clear here. I'm not criticizing every soldier who mans a checkpoint. Not even criticizing most of them, the vast majority of them. I know many of them personally. The vast majority have zero interest in humiliating or purposely delaying anyone. They're just trying to make sure that they're not letting in the next suicide bomber or stabber or mass shooter. And there are many of them there. But most Palestinians aren't the next suicide bomber or the next stabber or the mass shooter. And when Palestinian friends tell me about the humiliation of the checkpoints, well, frankly, it does sound terrible. It does. Nelson Mandela, a hero of the South African anti-apartheid movement, noted once that, quote, "There is nobody more dangerous than one who has been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly." I think he's right. Some forms of humiliation are inevitable. For example, during 67, Israel had 2 options: lose and be exterminated, or win and humiliate your neighbors and the Soviet Union. That's not really a choice at all. But that humiliation had serious consequences, like the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in which Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack to regain their lost honor, and the Soviet propaganda campaign against Israel and Zionism, which they seriously ramped up after Israel defeated their Arab clients in 1967. Link in the show notes for all this, by the way. Sometimes that humiliation goes hand in hand with fear. It's humiliating for parents to look helpless in front of their children. It's humiliating to look your child in the eye and say, "I can't protect you." But that's been the experience of too many Palestinians when they arrive at Israeli checkpoints. This is my friend Lana Eikelan. She's an American citizen, born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But when she was 8 years old, her family moved to East Jerusalem, where her dad is from. As she says, it was
the biggest cultural shock you could ever imagine.
Both of Lana's parents are Palestinian. Her father and brother have Israeli citizenship, but her mother, who is from Ramallah, is a citizen of the Palestinian Authority. The first time the Eikelans traveled to visit family in Ramallah, they got a rude awakening.
There are checkpoints everywhere. The checkpoints are all around the West Bank, the occupied territories of the West Bank, such as Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, Tul Karim. My mother didn't know that she needed certain papers to go back into Jerusalem because she's from the West Bank. So the soldier was looking at her and he's like, your papers, and he was speaking to her in Hebrew. My dad barely knew a couple words here and there in Hebrew. My mother, not at all. I didn't understand. I was 8 years old. My older sister was 9. My little sister also sitting next to me. She was 4. Then out of nowhere, you see this soldier come to her door, pointing his gun at her, telling her to get out of the car. I don't think that's what traumatized me as much as her face when she got out of an interrogation room after 8 hours.
Imagine being 8 years old and realizing that your mom can't protect you because she can barely protect herself. Lana's mom wasn't physically hurt, but the psychological wounds of that experience run deep. A toxic brew of fear and powerlessness and humiliation. And if something like this can happen in an area controlled by the Palestinian Authority, what happens in the other two sections of the West Bank, areas B and C? Area B. Area B makes up 22% of the West Bank's landmass. So 18 plus 22, we got 40% so far. There's the math for you. You're welcome. It's home to about 30% of West Bank Palestinians. Unlike Area A, it's mostly rural. Very hard word to say. Rural. Farmland, olive groves, shepherds tending their flocks. And unlike Area A, it's administered by both the PA and Israel. The PA takes charge of civilian stuff, schools, infrastructure, sewage treatment plants, all those things. But security is a joint effort. Are you surprised to learn that Israeli and Palestinian security forces cooperate closely? It's a thing. That they work together to stop organizations like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad from recruiting or carrying out terrorist attacks? It's true. Israel provides training and equipment, and the PA shares intelligence about potential attacks. Sometimes they even team up on joint operations, like when tensions flare between Israeli Jewish people living there and local Palestinians. Of course, not every Israeli is happy about the fact that Israel arms the PA security forces. Many are not. And many Palestinians deeply resent the PA's cooperation with Israel. In fact, many Palestinians deeply resent the PA full stop. In June 2024, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research found that a whopping 94% of Palestinians in the West Bank want PA President Mahmoud Abbas to resign. That's rough. So it's safe to say that no one really trusts the PA, not Palestinians and certainly not Israelis. But on paper, at least, Israeli and Palestinian security forces in Area B have the same goal: stopping terror attacks. Israeli citizens can enter Area B if they really want to. They'd be protected by the Israeli army if they did, but the Israeli government does not recommend it. Let's face it, right now, there's no real reason for an Israeli to enter Area B, not unless they were up to no good. So when you read about clashes between Israeli settlers and Palestinians, you're most likely reading about Area B, which leaves us with the third and most contentious part of the West Bank, Area C. Unlike Areas A and B, Area C is entirely under Israeli control. It sits on 60% of West Bank land, but most of its residents aren't Palestinians. They're Israeli Jews. Nearly 500,000 of them, to be exact, because Area C is the only area that contains the Jewish settlements. They live cheek by jowl with roughly 300,000 Palestinians, or 10% of the Palestinian population of the West Bank. The rules that govern the two populations are different, though. Just like Palestinians in Areas A and B, Palestinians in Area C have to go through checkpoints to enter or exit their homes. Unlike Palestinians in Areas A and B, Area C's Palestinians have additional restrictions on movement. There are places in Area C they're not allowed to enter, including certain roads which were built exclusively so Israelis can zip between the Jewish communities, what people call settlements, and Israel without cutting through Palestinian areas. The idea is to make travel safer for Israelis, including Arab citizens of Israel. But it leaves West Bank Palestinians with older, poorly maintained, less direct routes, like being stuck in the slow lane while watching others zip by in the highway. So when Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about separate road systems, this is what he means. In fact, lots of things are separate in Area C of the West Bank, like the court system. Remember, Israel is in full control here. So the 500,000 Israeli citizens in Area C get all the rights and protections afforded to citizens under Israeli law, but the roughly 300,000 Palestinians who live in Area C aren't Israeli citizens. They're subject to Israeli military law, with fewer legal rights and longer detention periods. It's a lot harder to appeal a military sentence than a civil one, because military courts have one aim: to stop security violations. But the definition of security violations is highly elastic. And military law in Israel trumps civil and international law. In fact, military courts can sentence anyone, including minors. Every year, hundreds of Palestinian minors are tried and sentenced in juvenile military courts, with many serving their sentences in Israel. A different system of laws for two populations in the same place. But it's not just the court systems that are different for Palestinians and Israelis in Area C. It's everything from allocation of resources to the security barriers that crisscross the West Bank. Israeli Jews living in these settlements in Area C enjoy reliable, steady access to water, which means their taps flow freely, their crops are watered, and their lawns stay green. On the other hand, more than 70% of Palestinian communities in Area C aren't connected to the water network and rely on tankered water at exorbitant prices. Recent studies show Israelis in the West Bank get about 3 times as much water per capita as Palestinians, and there are similar disparities when it comes to electricity. The disparities are obvious, and they're not pretty.
When I drive through a settlement and there's swimming pools, like right here, and over here, these people can't really access water.
And so for some, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, the apartheid argument is clear, and they leave it at that. They point to the unequal laws in Area C, the separate roads, the access to water. They point to the fact that Israeli settlements are allowed to flourish and grow easily, while Palestinians in Area C require hard-to-get permits before they can build. They point to the sheer disparity in land distribution, with Israel controlling 60% of the West Bank on behalf of Israeli Jews, who comprise roughly 15% of the population. They point to the non-contiguous PA-run areas all chopped up into tiny pieces and separated by checkpoints. And they point, of course, to the wall, or the fence, or the security barrier. I'm talking about the 439-mile-long structure that crisscrosses the West Bank and separates it from Israel. Many Palestinians call it the separation wall, or they even go so far as to call it the apartheid wall. Israelis call it the security fence. Yet another example of how differently the two sides view the conflict. In places, it's a wall, or more accurately, a bunch of walls, made up of concrete and towering up to 26 meters high. But in other places, it's a high-tech fence, complete with surveillance equipment. It's cut across the landscape since the early 2000s. Construction began during the Second Intifada to prevent all the suicide bombers and other terrorists from entering Israel from the West Bank. And guess what? It worked. After the first segment of the wall was completed in July of 2003, suicide bombings fell by more than 80%. Or put another way, Israelis suffered 73 suicide bombings between 2000 and 2003. From 2003 to 2006, there were only 12. Yes, I'm putting only in quotes because the number should be 0. Terror groups have admitted the wall is effective. In 2006, an Islamic Jihad leader, Abdullah Ramadan Shallah, admitted on TV that the separation fence is an obstacle to the resistance. And if it were not there, this situation would be entirely different. But what about the people on the other side? Like the checkpoints, the wall makes it extremely difficult for ordinary Palestinians to move around because it isn't built strictly along the Green Line, the internationally recognized boundary between Israel and the West Bank pre-1967. Instead, it reaches into the West Bank in several places, often enclosing Israeli communities, siphoning off an additional 10 to 15% of West Bank territory. But it doesn't just separate Palestinians from Israelis, it also divides Palestinian communities, splitting villages in half, separating farmers from their crops and families from each other. I've been there. If farmers want to tend their crops on the other side of the barrier, they need special permits, which means they have to deal with Israeli bureaucracy, which is difficult and unpleasant at the best times, not just for Palestinians, for Israelis. And this isn't the best of times for anyone. And the wall or the fence or the security barrier, or whatever you want to call it, has become a symbol of the whole sorry situation. Or, as Noor put it,
you will never ever understand what the occupation is until you really feel it, until you live in these circumstances.
Tell me what does it feel like?
It's someone choking you all the time. It's like you are being choked all the time. That's how I feel.
And that's the image I'm going to leave you with as we close out this episode. I'm certain that I've enraged some people. I'm prepared to bet that some of you are howling at me. You're just as bad as Ta-Nehisi Coates. You didn't mention the security concerns. First of all, I did, but there's a lot more, and I'll get into it. You didn't rebut any arguments against the claim that Israel is apartheid. Well, I actually think I layered it a lot. I promised that I would outline the daily reality for Palestinians and Israelis, and I think I did. Next week, we're going to complicate things a little bit more. We're going to talk about the context for the policies I've described above. We're going to talk about East Jerusalem and the thousands of Palestinians who repeatedly turned down Israel's offers of citizenship. We're going to go into why Area C is actually more complicated than what I said today and why the Palestinians don't have citizenship. We're going to talk about the peace activists and the politicians, some Jewish, some Arab, who are working to combat the charge of apartheid together because they don't see it as apartheid. And we're going to talk about why the Western activists who claim apartheid are actually hurting the Palestinian cause. That's right. Claiming apartheid hurts the Palestinian cause. As always, we'll close out with 5 fast facts and an enduring lesson as I see it. That's all for now. See you next week for the conclusion of one of the most intense and intensive episodes we've ever produced. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, a division of Open Door Media. If you want to learn and want to watch all these videos about the story of Israel, go to the Unpacked YouTube channel. Check it out. Really go to the YouTube channel Unpacked. It's great. And write to me at noam@jewishnpack.com. Your email might even get on the show. Pretty cool. This episode was produced by Rivki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Simon Apfel, Adi Elbaz, Hanser Perez, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.